The cold rain fell relentlessly, soaking the streets in a bitter embrace, as the storm raged on. In the heart of the storm, a lone German shepherd named Ranger sat motionless on the cracked pavement, his once majestic coat now soaked and clinging to his frail body. His paws were caked with mud, his tail limp and resting in a puddle, the water slowly pooling around him. Ranger had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, his gaze fixed on the small house just a few yards away, the place he had once called home. His ears twitched at the slightest sound, but all he could hear was the rhythmic patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Occasionally, headlights would flash across his hollow eyes as cars sped by, but no one stopped. No one cared. The house, with its chipped red door, remained silent and empty, and Ranger's heart sank with every passing moment. He remembered the day his owner, Daniel, had left. The flashing lights, the hurried voices of strangers, the men in uniforms who rushed in and carried Daniel out on a stretcher. Ranger had barked, desperate to follow, but the door slammed shut, leaving him outside, confused and abandoned. Days turned into weeks, the food bowl on the porch knocked over by the wind, its contents washed away by the endless rain. Hunger gnawed at him, but Ranger didn't leave. He couldn't. This was home. Daniel would come back. He had to. But as the days were on, the hope began to fade. His fur, once thick and golden, was now a tangled mess of grime and leaves. His ribs protruded beneath his wet fur, each breath a visible struggle. Despite the pain, the cold, and the exhaustion that threatened to consume him, Ranger stayed. He believed in the promise Daniel had once made, that he would never be left behind. As another gust of wind howled through the street, his body shuddered, but he fought to stay awake, keeping his eyes fixed on the dark window, hoping to see the familiar face he so desperately missed. Then, just as his vision blurred and the darkness of sleep crept in, a sound broke through the rain. The low hum of an approaching car, its headlights cutting through the storm. Ranger's heart fluttered weakly in his chest as he strained to see who it was. Could it be Daniel? Had he finally returned? The car slowed as it neared the house, its tires splashing through the puddles, and Ranger's eyes widened with anticipation. He tried to stand, but his legs trembled, too weak to support him. He collapsed back into the mud, his body shaking with the effort. The car stopped just a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, her hood shielding her from the rain. She looked at the house, then at Ranger. Her eyes widened with shock as she realized the pitiful state of the dog lying in the mud. Without a second thought, she approached him, her voice gentle. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" Ranger flinched at her touch, instinctively recoiling, but the woman didn't pull away. She stayed, her hand hovering just above his face, her gaze filled with compassion. "It's okay. I won't hurt you," she whispered. Ranger's trembling body relaxed as warmth began to seep into his cold, broken form. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt safe. She gently stroked his fur, her touch soft and steady, and Ranger, too weak to resist, leaned into her palm. Her name was Emily, and she couldn't bear to leave him there in the rain. She could see the pain in his eyes, the years of abandonment, and she knew she couldn't walk away. She carefully lifted him into her arms, feeling his fragile body tremble against hers. The journey to her car was a blur, the rain falling in sheets, but Emily's focus never wavered from the dog she cradled in her arms. He was freezing, his body stiff with cold, but he didn't fight. He didn't resist. When they reached the car, she carefully laid him on the back seat, covering him with a blanket. As the warmth of the car's heater began to spread, Emily whispered promises of safety, of hope. "You're safe now," she murmured. "I won't leave you." The world outside was still cold and stormy, but inside, warmth began to fill the space. For days, Emily stayed by his side. She fed him, cleaned him, and soothed him, slowly rebuilding the trust he had lost. Ranger's body slowly recovered, but his spirit remained broken. His nightmares plagued him every night, and the memories of the abandonment haunted him. Emily stayed by his side through it all, offering comfort and love in every whispered word. Then, one day, Emily discovered the worn collar hidden beneath his fur. It was faded, the tag nearly unreadable, but she could make out the name, Ranger, and a number. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the dog wasn't a stray. He had belonged to someone who had loved him, cared for him, and left him behind. Her mind raced with questions. Who was Daniel? Why had he abandoned Ranger? Emily didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing: Ranger deserved to know. He deserved the chance to be with the person he had waited for, the person he had never stopped loving. And so, she set out to find Daniel. The journey led her to a small, weathered house. Ranger's eyes lit up as they approached, his tail wagging in excited anticipation. When Emily unhooked the leash and let him go, Ranger bolted toward the door, his body trembling with excitement. He scratched at the door, barking for the man he had never stopped hoping would return. The door opened slowly. A frail man stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but when he saw Ranger, his face broke into a look of disbelief. "Ranger," he whispered, sinking to his knees as tears welled in his eyes. "I thought I lost you." Ranger rushed forward, his tail a blur as he licked Daniel's face, his cries filled with joy and relief. And Emily stood there, watching the reunion, her heart breaking. She had given him back to the man who had loved him. It was the right thing to do. But as she turned to walk away, tears spilled from her eyes. She had to let him go, but she would never forget the bond they had shared.